Spring, 1872. The sun was sinking over the high plains of New Mexico Territory, bleeding crimson light across a sky streaked with dust. The prairie winds screamed through broken fence posts, rattling dry grass and carrying with it the smell of rain that never came. Coyotes yipped in the far canyons, their voices echoing against the barren hills. The land looked endless, merciless, and empty except for one man. On the porch of a sagging ranch house stood a solitary figure, his hat brim shadowed eyes that had long ago grown tired of waiting for better days. Shoulders broad, beard rough, clothes worn to the thread, he was the kind of man who lived in silence and spoke only to his horses. For years, he had spent his evenings in quiet, leaning against the rail with only the howl of the wind for company. But that night, silence broke. A shape moved against the burning horizon. At first it was only a blur, dust whipping around it like smoke. Then the wind carried the sound hoofbeats, frantic and uneven. The rancher's hand went to the rifle propped by the door. He narrowed his eyes. A wagon lurched into view, wheels clattering, harness leather snapping under the strain. The horse pulling it looked half dead, froth flying from its mouth. On the driver's seat was a woman, dark hair streaming loose, bonnet torn, face streaked with dust and fear. Behind her, two children clung to the boards, their eyes wide, clothes ragged. The rancher lifted his rifle, uncertain if it was a trick. Then came the scream, the woman's voice splitting the dry air, calling for help. Before the rancher could move, the wagon struck a rut, splintered, and pitched sideways in a cloud of dust. The prairie fell silent again, except for the groan of the horse and the soft whimper of children. The widow dragged herself from the wreckage, clutching her kin, her gaze locking on the stranger standing in the doorway of the ranch. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The wreckage of the wagon still smoldered in the dust as night fell over the plains. Lantern light flickered from the porch of the ranch house, casting long shadows over the yard. The rancher, silent as ever, had hauled the widow and her children inside. Their horse lay lamed in the dirt, its labored breath fading with the last of the twilight. Out here, nothing survived long without shelter, and the widow knew it. She sat at the rough wooden table, her hands trembling as she pulled her children close, while the rancher leaned against the wall, his rifle propped near, studying her with eyes sharp as flint. The widow's voice cracked when she finally spoke. Her husband had been gunned down on the trail weeks before. She'd driven what was left of their belongings across the desert, chased by hunger and misfortune until the wagon gave way. Now she had nothing but two frightened children, ragged clothes, and a fire of desperation burning behind her eyes. She didn't ask for mercy. She demanded it, though her voice was low. The rancher said nothing. Words didn't come easy to a man who had lived years in silence, but he knew what was being asked of him. A choice lay before him: turn her away and keep his solitude intact, or take her in and invite ruin upon himself. Out here, a woman alone with children didn't stand a chance, and a man who sheltered them shouldered their fate as his own. He lit another lantern, the yellow glow filling the corners of the room. The widow's boy, no older than 10, clutched a pocket knife in his small hand, glaring at the rancher with suspicion. His sister, younger still, buried her face against her mother's side. The rancher's weathered hand twitched, as if to wave them off, but he lowered it. He had once seen such fear in his own reflection years back, in a time he never spoke of. When morning came, the prairie was drenched in gold light, the air already heavy with heat. The widow was outside, gathering the broken pieces of the wagon with stubborn resolve. The rancher found her sweating, her hair loose, her skirt torn, yet her jaw set firm. He told her the truth in as few words as possible. "You can't make it on your own. Not here." She turned, meeting his eyes, and for a moment the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The burden had been laid upon him, though he hadn't spoken the words. She was here. She would stay. There was no sending her back to the dust. And just like that, the rancher's quiet evenings ended, replaced with the clatter of children's feet on his porch and the scrape of extra plates at his table. But the frontier was cruel to those who carried more than their share. That very afternoon, the rancher rode into town for supplies, the widow's children trailing behind in awkward silence. He could feel the weight of eyes on him before he even stepped off his horse. Men lounged against hitching posts, spitting tobacco, their laughter sharp and cutting. They whispered as he passed, about the fool who dragged strays home, about the widow who brought trouble with her. Some tipped their hats mockingly, as if to a bridegroom. Inside the saloon, the talk grew louder. Whiskey glasses clinked, poker chips rattled, and in the corner, a group of ranch hands made their jokes plain. Ranchers found himself a family, one drawled, slamming his glass down. Couldn't buy a woman, so he hauled one in from the ditch. The others roared with laughter. The rancher kept his back straight, jaw tight, but his hand brushed the butt of his revolver before he forced it away. Violence would only add fuel to the fire. Still, when he stepped back out onto the boardwalk, the widow's boy looked up at him with eyes burning from the sting of those words. The rancher didn't say a thing, but he placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, firm as iron. That gesture alone spoke louder than all the jeers echoing down the dusty street. Responsibility had found him, whether he wanted it or not. It sat heavy on his chest, like the desert sun at noon, and though he had not chosen it, he could not walk away. Out here, in this ruthless land, to turn his back meant death. And so the lonely rancher found himself bound, not by blood or law, but by a burden he could neither refuse nor escape. Dust rolled through the main street of the little frontier town, carried by a restless prairie wind that never seemed to stop. Boards creaked under boots, shutters rattled on their hinges, and the sun burned overhead like a merciless eye. Into that silence came the sound of horses, two children riding stiffly on small ponies, their mother walking beside them, and behind them the rancher, silent as stone. Every head turned. The townsfolk had already heard the whispers. By now, the story had grown its own legs. A rancher who had spent years alone suddenly sheltering a widow and her kin. Some called it pity, others called it weakness, and more than a few called it sin. Women tugged their shawls tighter and whispered behind gloved hands. Men spat into the dirt, shaking their heads. The whole town was watching, and not with kindness. The widow kept her chin high, though her face was pale from the stares. Her children clung close, little hands gripping her skirt. The rancher strode beside her, hat pulled low, jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. He had endured the silence of the land for years. Now he had to endure the silence of people who judged without mercy. At the saloon doors, the laughter came first. A knot of cowhands leaned against the rail, whiskey on their breath and mischief in their eyes. One of them, broad-shouldered with a scar across his cheek, tipped his hat in a mock bow. "Well, look here," he drawled loud enough for the street to hear. "Didn't know the rancher was fixin' to raise another man's brood." The laughter exploded, harsh and cruel. The widow froze, color rising in her cheeks, and for a moment she looked as though she might crumple beneath the weight of it. But she didn't. She set her jaw and pulled her children closer, staring past the men as though they weren't even there. The rancher's hand brushed the grip of his revolver. A breath more, and the street might have filled with gunfire. But instead he stepped forward, boots heavy on the boards, and stood between the widow and the cowhands. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Move." Something in his tone made even the drunkest of them shift uneasily. They parted, grumbling, spitting into the dust, but the damage was done. Word spread quick in towns like this. Within days, the rancher and the widow were the talk of every porch and every back room. Supplies grew harder to come by. The storekeeper, once friendly, now measured out flour and coffee with a colder hand, charging more than he should. Neighbors who once nodded from their wagons turned their faces away. The widow's children were teased by other boys in the street, called strays and beggars. Even the preacher's wife whispered that no good could come from a woman shacking up on a man's ranch without proper vows. The rancher bore it with silence, but the widow did not. She walked the streets with her head high, ignoring the eyes that bored into her. At night, though, when the wind rattled the shutters and the children lay sleeping, she sat by the cold stove and pressed her hands to her face, shoulders trembling. The rancher saw, though he said nothing. Then came the night the sheriff knocked on the rancher's door, lantern in hand, hat in his other, his face shadowed with unease. He spoke plain. The town council had gathered, and there was talk that the widow should be sent away, for decency's sake. If the rancher wanted to keep her and her children under his roof, he'd have to answer to the law of men, not just the law of the land. The widow stood behind the door, listening, her hands clutched so tight her knuckles turned white. The children stirred in the loft, sensing the fear in the air. The rancher's gaze never left the sheriff's, his silence heavier than words. At last, he gave the smallest of nods. The sheriff sighed, tipped his hat, and left. But the warning lingered in the air, long after his footsteps faded into the night. The widow knew then what the rancher must have known from the start. By sheltering her, he had painted a target on his own back. They were no longer just fighting hunger and dust, they were fighting the judgment of every soul around them. And out here, in the Wild West, a community's scorn could kill as surely as a bullet. The days that followed carried a strange quiet across the ranch, as though the very land was waiting to see if the weight of scorn would break them. Yet within that silence, something else began to stir, something neither the rancher nor the widow had expected. It showed itself in the smallest of moments. One evening, the widow lit the stove with hands that still shook from the day's gossip. She moved slowly, her children huddled close. But when she turned, she found the table already set rough wooden plates, laid out by the rancher himself. He didn't say a word, only lowered himself onto the bench with the awkwardness of a man who had long forgotten the shape of family. The widow sat opposite, their eyes meeting across the lamplight, and for the first time she allowed herself a small, grateful smile. The rancher began to take the boy out with him into the fields. The boy's hands were clumsy on the rope, his boots too big, but he tried with a stubborn grit that made the rancher pause. Dust rose around them as they wrestled a calf, the boy toppling face first into the dirt and springing back up with fire in his eyes. The rancher gave no praise, only a slight nod, but it was enough. The boy straightened his shoulders, taller somehow than when he had left the house that morning. The girl, smaller and quieter, followed the widow everywhere, carrying little scraps of cloth and helping with the mending. One dusk, the rancher returned from the barn to hear soft humming through the open window. The widow's voice, low and steady, drifted out into the evening. She was teaching her daughter a tune, old and sorrowful, but warm. The rancher stood still in the yard, the fading sun catching the silver in his beard, listening like a man hearing music for the first time in years. Later, by the creek, the widow knelt to wash clothes while the rancher filled buckets beside her. The water shimmered under the moonlight, carrying their reflections side by side. The widow spoke first, her words quiet, as if carried by the current. She told of the night her husband was shot down, of the children crying in the dark, of the wagon that broke a day's ride from nowhere. She did not weep. Her voice was too worn for tears, but there was an ache in it that made the rancher's chest tighten. He answered her in his own way. He did not share details, only fragments of war fought long ago, comrades lost in dust, nights where the silence of the prairie was the only thing that kept him from losing his mind. He spoke little, but the widow heard the weight in those few words, and for the first time, she saw not just the solitude around him, but the solitude within. By early summer, the ranch began to look different. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning. The fence lines were repaired, the barn doors straightened, the sound of children's laughter mixing with the cry of hawks above the canyon. Where once the rancher's evenings had been filled with silence, they now carried the hum of life, fragile but steady. One night, after a long day of mending and hauling, the widow stepped onto the porch. The stars burned fierce and close above them. She found the rancher already there, leaning against the rail as he always had. But when she joined him, he didn't move aside. He let her stand shoulder to shoulder with him, both gazing out at the vast, endless dark. The prairie wind carried dust across the yard, but for once it felt less cruel. The widow's children slept inside, their breathing soft as the night itself. And though no vows had been spoken, no words exchanged, something had already taken root between them. Not love yet, not peace, but a quiet strength born of survival, the kind that only grew in the hardest soil. The land still waited, merciless as ever, and the town's scorn had not disappeared. But here, Within the wooden walls of a battered ranch, a bond had begun to form, and that bond, though unspoken, was stronger than dust, stronger than hunger, stronger than the loneliness that had once ruled the rancher's life. Summer thunder rolled heavy across the desert sky, black clouds gathering over the horizon like a wall of anger. By dusk, the air grew thick and restless, the wind snapping at loose boards and driving grit into every crack of the ranch house. The widow stood at the window, clutching her shawl as the prairie darkened to near night. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, hat pulled low, eyes searching the storm front with a soldier's instinct. Trouble was coming, not just the storm, but something riding with it. The first sign was the distant drumming of hooves. Outlaws, driven by greed and cruelty, had learned of the widow's stay at the ranch. They believed she carried hidden money, or worse, that the rancher had weakened himself by taking in strays. In lawless country, such rumors were enough to invite a raid. By the time the rain began to lash down, torches flared in the distance, half a dozen riders cutting through the night. Their whoops pierced the storm, cruel and hungry. The widow's children scrambled from their bed, fear widening their eyes as the thunder rattled the windows. The rancher shoved his rifle into the widow's hands, his voice a growl above the wind. "Stay with the young ones. Don't miss if you shoot." Lightning split the sky as the outlaws circled the yard, mud flying beneath their horses' hooves. Bullets cracked through the roar of the storm, splintering wood, shattering glass. The widow dropped low, pulling her children beneath the table, but her eyes burned with fire. She gripped the rifle, waiting. The rancher moved with calm fury, firing from cover at the porch rail. Each shot echoed like thunder, flashes of gunfire lighting his weathered face. But the storm was merciless. Rain-drenched powder, blurred vision, turned the ground to a sucking mire. One outlaw leapt from his horse, torch in hand, and hurled it onto the barn roof. Within seconds, flames licked upward, roaring against the storm, smoke billowing black into the night. The widow saw it first, the horses screaming, the barn timbers groaning under the fire. Without a thought, she shoved her children toward the cellar door and sprinted into the yard. The rancher roared her name, but she was already gone, skirts whipping in the wind as she snatched a bucket and fought the fire like a woman possessed. The outlaws laughed at the sight, one raising his pistol to cut her down. The rancher's bullet caught him first, sending him tumbling into the mud. But the others pressed harder, circling, firing wildly. The storm drowned everything: gunfire, screams, the hiss of rain against fire. The widow staggered back as a burning beam crashed down, the heat searing her face. The rancher leapt into the blaze, hauling her out by sheer force. His coat smoked, his arms scorched, but he dragged her to safety as the barn collapsed in a roar of flame and ash. Still, the fight raged. The rancher's rifle jammed, soaked through by rain. He drew his revolver, firing blind into the night. One outlaw dropped, another fled, but the last pressed close, pistol raised, teeth bared. The rancher, mudslick and bleeding, raised his weapon a heartbeat too late. The widow's rifle cracked. The outlaw's body spun and crumpled into the mud, torch falling useless in the rain. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of fire and the growl of thunder rolling away into the distance. The storm eased, but the damage was done. The barn lay in ruins, horses lost to the flames. Smoke drifted across the yard, mixing with the smell of gunpowder and rain-soaked earth. The widow slumped against the rancher's chest, her hands trembling as he held her steady. His face was cut, his clothes burned, but his arms closed around her with a strength that spoke not of victory, but of survival. The night had taken much from them: blood, fire, and what little safety they had clung to. And though they had driven the raiders away, the rancher knew this fight was far from over. The land had tested them, and in many ways, they had already lost. But as dawn threatened the horizon beyond the smoking ruins, one truth cut clear through the ash and silence. They had faced it together, and neither had turned away. Smoke drifted low across the yard as dawn bled pale light over the prairie. The storm had passed, leaving behind mud, ashes, and silence. The barn was a blackened carcass, its timbers smoldering, its roof collapsed. The rancher stood with his hands braced on the porch rail. clothes torn, beard singed, the taste of gunpowder still bitter in his mouth. Beside him, the widow wrapped her shawl tighter, eyes red from smoke and fear, her children clinging to her skirts. They had survived, but survival came with a price. That morning, the wind carried not laughter nor judgment, but the uneasy quiet of neighbors who arrived too late. Townsfolk trickled in curious, hesitant, their eyes darting to the ruins. No one mocked now. They saw the bodies of the outlaws dragged into the dirt, the burnt-out barn, the cuts and burns on the rancher's arms, the rifle clenched in the widow's grip. The sight silenced even the cruelest tongues. For the first time, whispers turned not to ridicule, but to respect. The sheriff raised his hat, not with warning this time, but with solemn acknowledgement. Through that bitter dawn, the widow and rancher worked side by side, hauling buckets of water to smother the last embers, laying to rest the horse that had perished in the blaze. Their hands, blistered and blackened, found each other more than once, clasping without words. And as the sun rose fully, painting the sky in gold, the family huddled together in the shadow of ruin, alone no longer. Time has a way of wearing down even the hardest edges. 6 months passed, then a year. The land healed, as did the ranch. Where ashes had once choked the yard, green shoots now pushed stubbornly through the soil. A new barn rose, its timbers straighter, its beams etched with the marks of every hand that had helped lift it. Neighbors who once stood in judgment now bringing hammers and nails. The fence lines stretched farther than before, enclosing cattle that fattened on fresh pasture. And from the chimney, smoke curled each morning, a sign of life and permanence. The rancher no longer walked alone at dusk. The widow no longer just a guest, but the soul of the place stood beside him on the porch, her children growing taller, stronger, running barefoot across the yard. In her hand she wore a simple silver ring, hammered from a melted spur, and given without ceremony, but with the weight of a vow no preacher's words could strengthen. Inside the barn, above the doorframe, a beam bore the carved initials of the family. The boy had cut them himself with his father's old pocket knife, letters rough but proud. Each time the rancher passed beneath, he traced the marks with his calloused fingers, as though sealing a promise with every touch. In the evenings, the sound of laughter replaced the lonely moan of the wind. Sometimes the widow hummed that same old tune by the fire, the children's voices joining hers. The rancher, once a man of silence, learned to let his own voice carry across the room, reading aloud from an old Bible or telling stories of cattle drives and storms he had survived. Loneliness had been burned out of him, replaced by something sturdier, something he had never thought he deserved. The town, too, changed. Where once there were jeers, now there were nods of respect. Men raised their hats when the rancher rode in, women greeted the widow with bread or cloth, and children no longer mocked, but ran to play with hers. The sheriff himself came by from time to time, not with warnings, but to share coffee and speak of weather and cattle prices. The scandal had passed. In its place stood a legend of endurance. One evening, nearly a year after the storm, the widow stepped onto the porch and found the rancher carving something into the post. She watched as his knife cut slow, deliberate strokes. When he stepped back, she saw what he had left. Not initials, not words, but a simple symbol of a fire flames curling upward. He turned, meeting her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not a man chained to solitude, but a man unafraid to let his life burn bright again. The prairie stretched endless beyond them, still harsh, still unforgiving. But where once it had seemed to mock their survival, now it bore witness to their strength. The ranch stood rebuilt, the family unbroken, and the quiet evenings were no longer empty. They had endured fire, storm, and scorn, and from it had risen something greater than survival, belonging. And as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in the same crimson it had on the day she first arrived, the rancher took the widow's hand in his, their fingers rough and scarred, yet steady. Together they faced the horizon, not with fear, but with the quiet dignity of people who had remade their lives from the dust. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again, across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe, to keep the fire of these stories alive.